Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Hi, welcome back. I'm here today to follow up on the conversations we've begun about trade, and discussions about trade have led to those roads have led to China. And today we're here to talk about trade and China. And with me to do this are two very smart men, Herman Perchner and Riley Walters. Herman is the founder in 1982 of the American Foreign Policy Council. He has traveled to China annually since 1994. He's been to Russia more than 65 times. He advises presidents, heads of state all over the world. Interestingly, his organization takes donations only from American citizens and U.S. entities. So, welcome.
Bill, pleasure to be with you.
Riley is a policy analyst for Asian economy and technology at the Heritage Foundation Asian Studies Center. He specializes in Northeast Asian macroeconomic issues, as well as emerging technologies and cybersecurity.
Thank you.
Well, we have two men that know a lot about this topic. Welcome, welcome. Herman, you just came back from China.
Yeah, I was in China in December, and two main takeaways I had, Bill. First, attitudes have changed markedly on North Korea, and I think the Chinese leadership has turned sour on the Kim regime. It's less clear what that will mean in terms of policy changes in China. My sense is that's still being debated inside closed rooms in Beijing. Second takeaway has to do with the growing social control over religion, over social media, over anything that's not directly under the thumb of the Communist Party. It's a trend that began under Xi and is accelerating in recent years.
I understand they have a facial recognition technology where they can round people up within an hour. Is that factual, or is that
I don't
apocryphal?
know about an hour, but they have facial recognition, and it's everywhere. So it's a means of greater control, for sure.
It's
Riley, jump in.
It's so everywhere that even public restrooms have facial recognition to allow you to only take out so much free toilet paper per day. It recognizes your face and knows you came to this park today and you've already taken 2 squares, and then tomorrow you can have another 2 squares.
You mean the extra water bottle I take from my gym is going to be surveilled pretty soon?
They'll know.
Do they have cameras in each one of these?
I don't know. I'm sure it's different. I think it was more of a introductory project. I'm not saying every public restroom has this, but it's part of China's Made in 2025, where they want to become sort of the next global technology leader. Beating out Silicon Valley, beating out Japan, beating out South Korea. They want to be the place for technology, I think.
Well, we've had discussions on this show about just how free trade oriented China is, and whether it's really a command and control economy disguised as a market economy. And we had a lively debate. Somebody, when I said they were mercantilists, said that was just utter nonsense. Do you have a view about that?
I would say that the economic freedom or trade freedom that you would see in China, I think it ebbs and flows, right? So I would say that since China joined the WTO back in the 90s, there has been an opening of China's market. But perhaps Herman could talk more about this. Under Xi's leadership, there's been perhaps a constraining of it through either the subjugation of minorities and religious freedom, as well as trying to maintain state control of state-owned enterprises and trade and investment aspects.
Xi now thinks that the communist cells that exist in companies will have a say in how private companies make their decisions in personnel matters. So what you have is the growing pervasiveness of the state. I think you are not going to see the privatization of the big state enterprises. They may become more important under Xi, even though it's less efficient.
About 50% of the significant companies in China are state-owned.
Yes.
And as I understand it, they've allowed even the entrepreneurs that aren't in the state-owned companies to join the Communist Party, or maybe they've required them to join the Communist Party. To what extent is that shaping industrial policy or whatever?
In communist societies, usually around 5% of the population join the party, and party membership is a prerequisite to management positions across the board. I mean, if you are a totally brilliant scientist, they'll let you be a scientist, but in general, if you're going to run something, you have to be part of the party, and being part of the party means attending party meetings, receiving education as to the party line, and to accept party discipline.
And if you're not a company who has a party member, you are required to have a party member a part of your board of directors or senior management. So it's a requirement that China's Communist Party is a part of your company, essentially. Yeah.
So trade is much on everybody's mind now as we speak. We've just had some talk about steel and aluminum tariffs slapped on imports, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. And I think this is just like shooting ourselves in the foot or in the head or whatever metaphor you want to use. I mean, do we really need tariffs on steel imported from Vietnam or Venezuela or Hong Kong? I don't know.
Or South Korea, Japan,
Or South Korea.
Canada, our allies.
Canada. I mean, Canada's a great example. If you look at the aluminum industry, I think if you take it together, we're strategically protected for years with the amount of aluminum we make together. So the idea that this is a strategic threat, that we're importing aluminum, is nonsense.
Right. Well, last year the president asked the Commerce Department to investigate, based on the authority given to them in legislation, to review whether the steel industry and aluminum industry are a threat, essentially. And the report that was released publicly, graciously, usually these reports aren't always released before the decision is made, lays out their national security concerns. And to be frank, they're bogus. Certainly, there's the national security argument is bad. The economic security argument is bad. To say that, these industries are at threat when the Department of Defense only uses 3% of steel made in America for their needs, and that for some reason our allies who we would rely on in war can't actually support us, is bogus. Also, they talk about the steel industry, but they don't talk about the overall macroeconomic effect of these imports. There's been a couple of studies that come out that say the U.S. could net loss 146,000 jobs. Another study said at least 90,000 in manufacturing alone. So,
Well, the Bush tariffs in 2002 cost about 200,000 jobs.
Yeah.
And somebody has pointed out that for every one job we've got in a steel company, there's 16 jobs in companies that use steel. So,
I have a question for Riley. I don't know too much about trade. I'm more expert on geopolitics, but I've heard it argued that making this announcement on tariffs is really the opening in a negotiation to have a more level playing field. Is there any truth in this argument?
that's one of the things I've heard. It kind of seems like every week the narrative around 232 kind of changes. At first,
232 means?
232 is the investigation done by the Commerce Department. It is what the president would use to assign these tariffs.
It was the document that Trump got to say, we got to slap these tariffs on
Yes.
because it's strategically important.
Correct.
Meant he could do it without congressional approval.
Correct. It gives him Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of the 1960s, grants him explicit authority to go around Congress and implement these taxes on steel imports. So as I was saying, the narrative seems to change every week. At first, it was leveling the playing field with China. Then there were national security concerns, since that is what the legislation is meant to address. The 232 legislation, not any new legislation. Now I hear things that it's perhaps a negotiating tactic for NAFTA. It's not. It doesn't really have anything to do with China. It's not leveling the playing field with China. It's leveling the playing field with Mexico and Canada. So every week it's a new target. it
Well,
seems.
I hope it's something like that, because otherwise it looks like we've got four old guys in their 70s and 80s who think the next war we're going to fight is World War II. Because the manufacturing industries that count are all the high-tech industries, which is where China's concentrating its
But
resources.
Bill, I know you don't think being in your 70s is old.
No, I'm close to thinking that's young. Very close. But at least we don't think the next war we're going to fight is World War II. Well, what about the geopolitical implications of this? I'm looking at a chart that was in a journal today. Greg Ip put something together that's something that, like, China's now gone from like 10% of the steel produced in the world to 50% of the steel in the world for strategic reasons. And my libertarian friends say they foolishly continue to build new aluminum smelter capacity, even though it has no cost advantage. And by basically selling aluminum below cost, they're giving it away to U.S. consumers, subsidizing Americans who drink beer from an aluminum can. I mean, is that, or the libertarian, is it?
Well, you have, and Riley's more the economists, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they have overcapacity for sure, not just in aluminum and steel, but other industries. But they look at state-run enterprises as a way of keeping people employed, which they need to do, and they will spend some of this overcapacity in building out the Silk Road Initiative, as well as infrastructure projects in China and other places, and they think this serves a strategic aim, too, of spreading Chinese political influence as well as doing it for economic reasons.
And the Silk Road Initiative, there's also the One Belt, One Road Initiative. Is that the same thing? Or is that
the same thing.
What is that?
Riley, you wanna jump in?
So it goes by several names. The Silk Road is from the history of China, the ancient trade routes it would take through Central Asia to Europe.
Spice trade, silk trade.
Silk Road. So
very exotic, very historic, very interesting.
The Chinese, the current administration in China is seeking to build sort of a Silk Road 2.0. This means increasing transportation both by land and by sea to all over the world. Name a place, they're trying to create a means of transportation to that area. It was originally called the One Belt, One Road when it first came out. The Chinese have since changed that for PR purposes because One Belt, One Road, One China is a bit exclusive sounding.
It's all pretty aggressive.
Right, exactly. I think actually in Chinese it's still the same. The Chinese term for One Belt, One Road, or as it's called now in English, the Belt Road Initiative. They just took out the one. It's still the same, but for PR purposes, for selling it to Americans or Eastern European countries or Western European countries, it's now the Belt Road Initiative, and it means anyone can join.
Well, Herman, is this for commercial purposes or is this for geostrategic purposes? I know they've basically purchased the Port of Piraeus in Greece, and they want to make that the largest deepwater port in Europe.
The answer is it's both, and I think Riley made a good comment. It's not just one belt and one road. There are many trade routes. If you see a map of them, it's like spaghetti with all kinds of different routes. I think the Chinese see the following advantages. One, they can tie in some of these developing economies permanently to the Chinese economy, so they have customers that will be there for generations. I think they see it as a way of getting influence. If they have big infrastructure projects, they get UN votes along with it. They're using Greece, which you mentioned, in particular, to try to break up European unity regarding policy towards China. They invest so much in Greece, they expect to have Greece advance pro-Chinese positions.
The Europeans are getting a little alarmed, though. They've been buying up a lot of infrastructure in Europe, and the EU Commissioner, European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker,
Yeah.
they're now examining these purchases that they say if they want to buy a harbor or part of our infrastructure or defense technology firm, we want to look at this a lot closer, which is what we're doing in the United States with CFIUS. CFIUS means?
CFIUS is an acronym, CFIUS. It stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's a multi-agency committee that reviews foreign investment for national security concerns. And you're right.
And it's lodged in the Treasury Department.
It is chaired by the Treasury Department,
Okay,
yes.
right,
yes.
right.
But, using ports for strategic reasons isn't anything new. Hutchison Whampoa, a major Chinese company with ties to their defense ministry, operates the ports on the Panama Canal. Now, things will be normal as long as there's no crisis in Taiwan. If there's ever a shooting war in Taiwan, will American ships have access to the canal? I doubt it.
Well, the question I keep asking me is that I come to things as a visceral free trader, libertarian, let's let people innovate, create businesses, compete worldwide, don't have any barriers. Yet China doesn't seem to be playing with that rule book. It seems like they're playing very much within the mercantile model, which is where they see this is not necessary. They don't need a return on investment. They're willing to invest to get a strategic foothold in not only infrastructure, ports and things like that, but also technology in particular. They're really pushing.
And raw materials. When they wanted to teach Japan a lesson, they withheld rare earth minerals, which they have a near monopoly on. And I think in the mind of the Chinese politicians, the price of any good is not just economically determined, but you can add a political surcharge on it to score points on the political side, not just in your bank account.
For the so there's actually, you're right, there's a bit of a division in the European community, since the EU has both very advanced economies and still similarly developing economies, and the approach that the Chinese have been taking and the response by individual European countries is very divided between those countries who are poor, who would like capital invested in their countries, versus those economies like Germany, who are very advanced and are skeptical of the security implications of companies like China buying up, say, their, the number one robotics manufacturer, which Germany used to have, and what that means for both the future of Germany economically and security-wise.
We run about a $375 billion, although I think Donald Trump told us recently it was $500 billion, but I don't know if that was just to make it huger or not. But does that matter? $500 million trade deficits with China?
No.
No? Herman?
I think
Riley?
I think our cumulative,
We gotta know it.
our cumulative trade deficit is not sustainable over the long run. And I'm less concerned about an individual country than the total amount.
I am less worried about the trade deficit than I am perhaps Chinese ownership of U.S. securities. Now, I think there's not as big a threat, I think, from either one.
Ownership of U.S. securities, meaning ownership of U.S. firms? Or
No, bonds and securities. So
Okay.
After the financial crisis, the Fed issued quantitative easing, which sold Treasury securities and bonds, which were purchased by foreign companies and things like that.
But I could be, I'm not totally current on this, but I thought their ownership of those securities has dropped pretty substantially, and instead they've shifted their purchases to real companies, which brings us back to the CFIUS, where they're trying to acquire actual companies in the United States.
Yeah. But even that wouldn't count for the trade deficit, though.
Yeah.
If anything, that would actually change it. Typically, the correlation between trade and investment is that a company, say a Japanese company, invests in an American company to export back to Japan, or vice versa. Say, an American company will invest in China to invest and export back to the United States. So the trade deficit, I think, there's no real security concern. I think there's no way that China tomorrow can say, we have a deficit in trade and you owe us, essentially.
I'm not so much worried about the financial implications. The thing that concerns me is that I think a nation's strength is its productive capacity. And we've had leadership in manufacturing and technology, information, internet, all that. We've been a leader there, and our productive capacity is such that gives us a lot of strength as a country strategically. And we've already seen a lot of the manufacturing hollowed out in the sunset industries, and I think they are. But that's not what China is interested in. I mean, they want to be a leader. This is their 2025 strategy. They want to be a leader in semiconductors, computers, software, biotech, pharmaceuticals, electric cars, batteries, robotics, drones, virtual reality, artificial intelligence. They're on record as saying, in 2025 is only 7 years from now. Herman, is this rhetoric, or are they executing on the strategy?
I think the Chinese are highly ambitious, and they wish to extend their hard and soft power worldwide. And I don't see anything they've done that runs contrary to that motive. And they're very long range in their projections. For instance, we sponsored a book well reviewed by the Financial Times a few years ago, China and Africa. And we took a look at what the Chinese state companies were doing there. And essentially, the Chinese government said, all right, it's in our national interest to tie up all the mineral wealth, all the petroleum assets that we can. And state company, what do you need to do that? Do you need bribes? No Foreign Corrupt Practices Act governs Chinese companies. Do you need infrastructure projects? Do you need military sales? Whatever you need, you have. Just tie it up. And they've done that. And but with controlling these raw materials, they're also buying political influence. And if you watch votes in the UN and the foreign policy of some African countries that have heavy Chinese investment, you see that.
Well, doesn't America's sort of visceral free trade philosophy, doesn't that leave us extremely vulnerable to them? Riley's written on an example of a company where they stole something like $800 billion of. That number's got to be
not a specific company. No.
Okay, tell us about that and what we ought to know.
You're talking about intellectual property theft, and so the Commission on Intellectual Property Theft estimates that annually up to $600 billion worth of wealth is lost from the United States through intellectual property theft or transfer of perhaps not like patents exactly, but technical know-how, best practices, things of that sort. A significant chunk of which is done by the Chinese. And
how does that happen? I mean, what's the trade? I mean, if you're
it could come from anything from cyber theft, which is a big proponent. There's also either forced transfer or coerced transfer. There's a bit of a difference there. Say I'm an American company and I invest in China and I develop a really strong product, and then one day the Communist Party comes in and takes it. That's forced transfer. The other one is, say I have a strong product and I want to get access to the Chinese market. The Communist Party will say, well, you need to give us that technology already if you want to invest here.
So I'm a CEO of a multinational company. And I want to go into China, and so I go to China and with my people, and we have a meeting, and they say, well, that's great. If you want to be here, you need to give us access to your technology. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, that happens. And
Herman, you were...
That's correct, but it also can be more subtle. You can come in, you bring your best technology, and you have to hire as managers Chinese. And when the Chinese managers are there enough years, they figure out not just what's patentable or not patentable, but as Riley said, tradecraft. And when they have it down, then they go out and open their own company to compete with you, because they don't need you anymore.
Or you think you have a partner in China, and then based on just the rules that govern patent protection and how they differ in China and Japan, they can game.
And they basically don't protect intellectual property.
Essentially, I mean, they have a certain set of rules, but the courts are very sporadic It could be different depending on either like the state or local level, and the implementation of a unified property right is just non-existent.
But their greatest good is, well, our greatest good is the rule of law, the Constitution, the respecting contracts, good courts and judges and things like that. Theirs is the party. And the party said, we want to be the leader in all these strategic industries, so go get this technology, and we're not going to ask any questions how you get it.
Well, also the party governs all courts. There are some moves to make the courts more independent, but if a senior party official interferes in a court case, the judge won't rule contrary to the party official. It's been curbed a little bit, and now if a party official intervenes, it becomes part of the official record. And if they intervene to line their own pockets, they're in trouble. If they intervene to protect the Communist Party's interests, they may be promoted.
Have you been following the whole anti-corruption campaign?
Yes, carefully.
How does that, has that...
To do business in China is akin to operating a bar in a college town. Every bar owner is guilty every night. There's always somebody underage in. So the question is, if you're going after corruption in China, whose corruption are you going to go after? Do I go after Bill Walton, who's a good friend of Xi, the head of the Communist Party of China, or do I go after Riley, who maybe is not so friendly to Mr. Xi? So it's become, it's anti-corruption.
And all eyes are staring at Riley now.
But it's also a question of consolidation of power.
So I'm late to this game. I've really just become aware of some of these issues. One of the things I've been learning is that if you look at their education systems, they're very oriented towards technology. There's STEM degrees, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. They're awarding 1.3 million every year, and we're at like 300,000. They're very much saying you want to go to college, you've got to learn something, a hard science.
If you look at the Political Bureau, the Politburo, which is the leading body in China, you'll find they've been disproportionately engineers. And we don't have that in this country, but they have.
Wait. Their government is primarily engineers?
China's
as opposed to lawyers?
What a committee
wonderful...
of a Politburo, which maybe it's 7 people now. It's been 9. And if you look at the background of most of the people that have served there over the past couple of decades, I think you find they're engineers.
That's fascinating.
And that's why, in part, they were able to guide the industrialization, because they understood it.
Well, that's a totally different mindset from most of our Western politicians.
Yes?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you put it. Well, it explains an awful lot, though. It also explains that they think in systems and building. They're not interested in sort of letting 1,000-something bloom. They want to instead control outcomes the way engineers do.
Yes, they like predictable outcomes. Very much.
Yeah.
Now, Herman, you've been to China every year since 1994. I think you know a lot more than you're saying. Can you give us an anecdote of something like that where you've seen? I'm setting you up so you can't go on your next trip. All right, Riley.
Well, anyway, well, we have a few stories. When I first went to China, there were more bicycles and cars in Beijing and other cities. And the amount of economic progress is jaw-dropping countrywide. And this is how the Communist Party legitimizes its rule. The people, and including party people, worry about corruption. They don't like it. But as long as they're living better and everybody's living better, they give the party a lease on life, and they think the party has earned the right to continue to govern. But now with Xi, you have a clamping down, maybe because they're afraid that freedom has permitted people to go in directions that are not fully under party control. And in their mind, that's akin to chaos. And if you have a country of 1.3 billion, maybe 400 million people, to have things out of order is frightening, especially for those that remember the anarchical days of the Cultural Revolution, which was a nightmare for anybody who went through it.
That's where we get back to where we started with the facial recognition.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
You mentioned bicycles, and it made me think of the sharing economy.
Yeah.
And so the sharing economy is essentially this new idea that individuals can share products, capital goods. It's maybe better to use an example. Think of Uber. Uber or Lyft or these ride-sharing cars are an aspect of the sharing economy. You can call up a car, and it's not yours, but you share it with others. In China and some in DC and other states, we have bike sharing systems. For DC, I think there's maybe 5 or 6 companies that specialize in bike sharing. China is very prolific in bike sharing, so much so that their market's actually completely saturated by it, to the fact that there's an oversupply of bikes, to the fact that it kind of makes me think of Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, I believe they drained one of the rivers once, and it was just completely littered with bicycles. But I draw that analogy to kind of say that, typically in capitalist countries, there's competition that drives out inefficiencies. In China, you don't necessarily have so much of that competition. So you end up creating an oversupply of bikes when people do want bikes in China, but when you've got, I don't know,
There are no market signals.
10 bikes per one person, something, I don't know if that's a real statistic, but something along that line, you create inefficiencies in your economy, and that's just in bikes. What do you do when you have overcapacity in steel? What do you do when you have overproduction of other types of machinery and so on and so forth?
Well, the Chinese are shifting their gaze from bikes and steel and aluminum to the high tech, and they're underwriting infrastructure, technology infrastructure, the way we might think about our $1 trillion infrastructure program here.
If you go to the best engineering programs in the U.S., you have a disproportionate number of very bright Chinese. And the shift I see coming over the next 10, 20 years is the Chinese now are establishing their own higher ed in technology. And they are going to create absolutely world-class engineering programs. And the number of patents I predict that are taken worldwide by China is going to increase in percent by a significant amount.
I think
If we don't do better with educating people in engineering here and mathematics and hard science, it's a long-term problem for us.
I think China is already outranking both, U.S. and Japan, two of the largest patent countries that patent the most already by maybe a factor of 3 or 4.
Yeah, but part of that is mitigated by the fact that technology is changing so fast that many of our companies in Silicon Valley do not even patent anymore, because by the time you go through the patent process, it's already old technology. Right. So I'm not sure that innovation is so disproportionately with China, but the trend line is there.
I agree. I think perhaps a lot of those patents are just, I don't know, I think of patent trolling, people who are just creating patents for the sake of patents.
We've got a couple of minutes here to wrap up. Riley, what would you work in the area of intellectual property, theft, acquisition of companies, and that piece of the world. What would you see that we need to be focusing on now to protect American interests?
Protecting our rule of law. We've mentioned this already. It's one of the guiding aspects, and to allow theft to continue, theft of intellectual property, I think sort of undermines that. So I think we need to address the theft problem before we address any unfair trade practices.
And you had 3 steps to take. Maybe the Department of Commerce would set up a watch list. And what was that punch list of things we need to do?
Companies can work, or the Department of Commerce can work with companies to sort of non-publicly, because I know a lot of companies are sensitive about this topic. You don't want to say that I've been a victim publicly, but they can work with the Department of Commerce to identify things that have been stolen or copied illegally by Chinese entities, and allow the Commerce to sort of create a list. And this list can of either companies that are known thieves of intellectual property or use products that are knowingly stolen. So like, perhaps one Chinese company steals it, but they share it with all their other Chinese companies at the, because the party says they need to. So they're all guilty, essentially.
Yeah.
Guilty by association. They create this list, and then the Treasury Department, who has the ability to sanction companies, comes in and says, look, you've stolen American property. You're not allowed to access the American financial markets anymore.
Bingo. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Herman.
If the countries of South and Southeast Asia think the U.S. will not maintain a robust military presence and will not engage actively on a diplomatic front, they will accommodate to China, and it will result in long-range trade disadvantage to the U.S. as we would seek to trade with traditional partners like Japan and South Korea. There was a study some years ago by Morris Rosaby, I think is at Columbia, talking about how China defeated its enemy at the time, the Mongols, through trade war. They have millennia of history of dealing with these problems, and to the extent that they're able to use geopolitical means to influence trade, they will do it. It's worked for them in the past, and they will have confidence it will work in the future.
Troubling, fascinating. We've barely scratched the surface. Let's come back and talk some more about this. It's clear, though, that while we're spending all our time worrying about Russians and elections and actresses, a lot of things are happening we should be paying far more attention to. In this case, it's China. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
There you go.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.